We will wait a couple minutes as folks come in. I can see people popping in, so we'll give it just a minute and then we'll get started. All right, welcome to everybody who is coming in. We're going to wait just a minute because I can see folks are still coming in, and then we'll get started when it looks like it has slowed down. All right, good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for our conversations with CKG, Drugs and Alcohol Effects on Teen Mental Health. I'm Susan Lindsay, Director of Programs with the Cameron K. Gallagher Foundation, and this is part of our Conversations with CKG discussion series, a community platform which seeks to take the whispered, hidden conversations about mental health into open, supportive, educational dialogue. So we are going to start this evening with a poll, which we have not done before. So bear with me as I hopefully launch our poll. All right, it looks like it's up. Can you guys see it?
We can.
Okay, great. So our poll will stay active throughout the introduction. If you can please let us know what your top concerns are tonight so that we can kind of tailor our conversation to everyone's needs. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A feature. We ask that you use the Q&A to ask your questions. You are welcome to use the chat to make comments, but if you put questions in the chat, it can be kind of hard to pick them out. So if you can put them in the Q&A, it just makes it really clear for us where the questions are. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible throughout the hour. A recording of tonight's conversation will be available on ckgfoundation.org. And a follow-up email will go out after the event with a link to the recording, as well as a list of additional resources. We are joined by two guests this evening. Kerri Rhodes is a licensed professional counselor and licensed marriage and family therapist. She is a counselor with Henrico County Public Schools, and she also has a private practice in Henrico County. She writes, speaks, and advocates for those struggling with substance use disorder and their families. She blogs at ifyouthink.its.hard-to-watch.com and posts on a Facebook page in her son's memory. I connected with Kerri after hearing her speak at a recent Silent No More webinar, which is a collaboration between the Eastern District of Virginia's U.S. Attorney's Office and the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, which is a collaboration. They pull in local resources in whatever locality this is taking place in. So it happens to be in Hanover, hosted by Patrick Henry High School. So they pulled in Hanover resources, Hanover Cares, the Hanover Sheriff's Office. It was very impressive, very comprehensive. And I'm really grateful to have connected with Kerri and to have her join us tonight. So we will provide more information about Silent No More in the follow-up email that goes out. We are also joined by licensed marriage family therapist Ashley Morgan Soukup with Summit Emotional Health. Ashley works with children, adolescents, and adults, specializing in post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma, marital concerns, anxiety, depression, attention deficit disorder, substance abuse, and behavioral concerns. So Ashley assists individuals and families in exploring new patterns of communication and relational engagement to support one another and promote long-lasting change within the family. So thank you to Kerri and Ashley for joining us tonight. All right, so our poll, it looks like most concern is alcohol, marijuana actually first, then alcohol, then opiates, and other. And if you put other, if you want to share in the chat, we would love to know what those other concerns are. So I'm going to go ahead and end our poll. All right. So I would like to start this evening by talking about the biology of what happens in the brain when a teen uses alcohol or drugs, because that really is the basis for everything else that we're going to be talking about tonight. So Kerri, do you want to tackle that question?
Sure. So Adolescence for all of us, anybody on this call, none of us would go back there, right? It is one of those times in your life where it is incredibly difficult to navigate. And it's incredibly difficult to navigate because the brain is doing all kinds of crazy things during that time. So the brain is doing, a teenage brain is doing what we call pruning itself. Like if you've ever seen a rose bush and you prune it back, when you prune the rose bush back, you enable it to really grow. Well, that's happening. So teens are literally like losing billions of neurons every day, which would explain a lot of the behavior, right, that we see with our teenagers. The only other time that the brain prunes itself that much is when we are about 2 or 3 years old. And for everybody who has a teenager, at times you think, am I talking to my 2-year-old? Right? Because the behavior it's a lot, sometimes it's very similar, right? Remember when you're 2-year-old, you could say like, do you want a cookie? And they're like, no, and of course they wanted it, and teenagers, I think, are going through a lot of those same struggles with emotional regulation and problem solving and just kind of figuring out, what they're doing in the world, right? So the brain is in, it's in a state where there's a lot happening. So, and it's difficult for them to regulate a lot of their emotions. And that's why we see a lot of these mood swings and, things with teenagers, and they can be very sullen one moment. And then, another minute they're happy, and you're like, what is happening? It almost feels like like schizophrenia is happening right in front of your face, and that's not what it is. They're just teenagers, and you never really know what you're going to get. And we're all lucky to have survived it, right? And I think teens today, I think we all, have our cross to bear. I'm not going to say it's harder, but it's very different. Technology, I think, we're in an age where every teenager right now grew up with technology from the time they were very, very young, unless you as a parent strategically took it out of their lives, right? And so, their brains are also hardwired to be on all the time and to be stimulated all the time. And the human brain's not meant to have that happen. So I think that's one of the pieces I just want to kind of throw in there, because I think it's important when we talk about substance abuse to talk about what happens when the brain actually gets that pause, right? So the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of this front part of your brain right here, that's your brain's executive functioning area of your brain. It's like your brain secretary, right? So it's a really important part of the brain. So often in private practice, and I know probably Ashley's had this too, but, parents will come and you'll have a kid who's lying or, doing things that you're like, what is happening? This is not the child I raised. And I often, assure parents like your child's still a great kid. It's just their executive functioning part of the brain is just not finished developing. And so, they don't really do that higher level thinking. And the other thing that's happening in a teenage brain that I think is really important to remember is that a function of what's happening is, as part of how that brain develops, it overplays reward and underplays consequence. So when we say to a teenager, why did you not think about what was going to happen? Like, honestly, from from a neurological standpoint, they can't sometimes, right? Their brain overplays that reward and underplays consequence because that front part of their brain is just not as developed. So they're literally dodos, right? They really are. So, that's why they do risky things and they don't really think about the consequences. So a lot of times that's how drugs and alcohol are introduced into this, because there is this risk taking without the thought for what can happen down the road. So when we introduce drugs to the brain, we're playing with a chemical, and I think this is a chemical I talk about a lot, and it's a whole lot more complicated than this, but I think this is a really important thing to recognize, is that dopamine is a really important chemical in the brain, right? So we all have dopamine, and dopamine is responsible for learning and pleasure and motivation, and especially pleasure. So if you have a teenager who is struggling with mental health issues or just struggling in general, a lot of times their dopamine levels are lower because they don't feel good, right? You're struggling, you don't feel good. And when we are stressed, we have cortisol and adrenaline flowing, and that lowers dopamine. So dopamine levels are lower. Well, when we use drugs, and it doesn't matter what the drug is, we shoot dopamine levels through the roof. And that's why we feel good, because when we shoot dopamine up, it makes us feel good because it increases pleasure, right? And our brain is a reward seeking structure. It likes reward, right? We get dopamine from lots of things in life. You get a good grade on a test and your parents are proud of you, it shoots your dopamine up. You eat your favorite ice cream, it shoots your dopamine up. You exercise, it shoots your dopamine up once you get past being sore and not feeling like you're going to die. But there are lots of ways to naturally increase dopamine. But substances, especially drugs, they shoot that dopamine up really high. And when they do that, they attach to what we call these little receptor sites. So if you think about like your brain having like little Velcro pads in it, we have these receptor sites, and different drugs hit different receptor sites in the brain, and they get that high, right? And every time they do it after that, the high is never quite as good, but the brain is calling for that because it wants that dopamine release. And so, I want to talk about this more like as we go on, because this is part of what happened in my own son's story that I didn't understand honestly until much, much later. And I wish I had. But that's what puts kids so at risk, is that we really don't know, who it's going to grab, because what happens in the brain is when we introduce something like, let's say, an opiate into the brain and it shoots the dopamine through the roof, the brain is really smart and it says, God, there's way too much of this. We don't need to produce any. And so your body stops producing dopamine. And so the only way the brain gets it is then to call the substance. And the brain's smart. It knows where it got it from. So it will call that back. And, and that is kind of where people get, that's kind of the line, for addiction, is when the brain is not producing its own dopamine, it's going to get it from somewhere. And that's when people have a really hard time. And you'll often hear people in recovery talk about feeling terrible. And my own son talked about this. And he said, I don't feel motivated. And he was really bright, learning's really hard. And this is the first time it's ever been like that. I just don't understand what's going on. Why do I feel so terrible? And I wish I'd known to say to him, your brain is not producing dopamine, because that was really the truth of the matter. So, and different substances, affect the brain in different ways. So when we're talking about alcohol, that's a depressant, right? So it actually attaches and it slows down your central nervous system. That's what people get. They slur their speech and they get clumsy and things like that. So depressants slow down things. And then we have stimulants. And opiates are also a depressant, by the way, if you're so it's like alcohol, opiates, things like that. Xanax is a depressant. And then you have stimulants that ramp that up. So amphetamines, things that you might see it in, like Sudafed, caffeine as a stimulant, cocaine, right, meth, right. All those things speed up the central nervous system and make us super alert and super focused and really speed things up. And then we have kind of hallucinogens, which, they really alter our perception and how we see the world. So like LSD would be in that category. So all those things are affecting the way the brain is perceiving the world, and through our central nervous system, which is kind of responsible for kind of everything we do. And then marijuana is in that, I think, kind of that other category. And there's some debate about where it kind of goes, but there is a mind altering piece. The THC piece is does alter perception, but it's not really thrown in with the depressant. So it's kind of in its own category in terms of what it does. But there are a lot of myths surrounding that as well. And, and I think since we've legalized it, that's a discussion, worth having, because I think we're sending a message in that, for a lot of teens to say, this is not that bad, and in truth, I really think it's important for all of us to know what we're dealing with, and when we're making those decisions. And the truth is that marijuana is as addictive as any other substance, so, Ashley, is there anything I left out?
No, I think you totally nailed it.
Okay.
I'm enjoying listening to you. So this is great.
I am going to share my screen. While I'm doing that, I saw that we had a comment about huffing. And I am actually not familiar with that. So if you guys want to address for everybody what that is.
Yeah, so I mean, huffing is so people it's an inhalants, and it's a way of getting high. The brain's oxygen supplies, is a lot of times cut off when we do that, and so the kids, they have kind of a euphoria And then sometimes they can, actually pass out and have things like that happen. But it's, it again, it's as addictive as anything else. And we're playing Russian roulette with the brain, because when we cut off oxygen in the brain, obviously there are a lot of reasons not to do that. But a lot of, kids, they'll huff gasoline, markers, whipped cream cans, what's the air, compressed air. There's all kinds of things that they get themselves into. And so I think as a parent, like, being aware of what's in your house and what's around your house. And if you see weird things in your kids' rooms, really, really paying attention to that. If it seems out of place, it probably is.
Mhm.
Thank you for addressing that. So we all think, not my child, it's never going to be my child, or it's never going to be my family, which is why Taylor's story is so important for all of us. We can all learn from Taylor, and really a thank you to the Rhodes family for their bravery and sharing Taylor with us. So we have a video.
Every day since Taylor died, I started to write. This is from day 34. I tell myself over and over, I will not let this all be for nothing. I will be honest and vulnerable and brave because you were. I will show the good, the bad, and the ugly. You and I will own this story, and we will walk inside it together, just like we did for 20 years and 12 days. Love, Mom.
Oh yeah, that's one of my favorites. Mm-hmm. Taylor was the big personality in the family. I don't know that he necessarily always wanted to be center of attention, but he didn't mind it either.
He liked to live life big. He came out with a foot on the gas pedal. He wanted to go, go, go.
He was fearless. He was going to do anything to kind of achieve his goals.
He had a huge heart, extremely loyal, maybe to a fault at times. He just loved big.
He taught me a ton of life lessons, and his addiction probably taught me the most important ones.
He was a great athlete. He could do anything he wanted to do. At the age of 14 or 15 years old, Taylor had a pretty significant tennis injury.
Started with a shoulder surgery and a bottle of Percocet to manage his pain, and that was the beginning.
It was years later that he would tell us that when he took that Percocet, it was the first time his brain lit up. It was the first time he felt normal. It was the first time he didn't feel anxiety. He didn't feel depressed because he had a history of anxiety and depression. And he said from that point on, he was hooked. It wasn't necessarily, it was just opiates. It was Xanax, pot, alcohol. Sometimes it was just whatever he could get his hands on.
He'd say, well, I'm not doing anything different than other kids were doing. And he was right. He wasn't. But, he knew that every time he touched any of those things, his life went terribly wrong. Terribly wrong.
Seeing it consume him in a way and consume our family, I kind of isolated myself. I had no control, no influence on what he did next. It's pretty a lonely place, honestly.
It is like grieving a child that you love more than anything, and they're standing right in front of you, but you don't recognize them. You see the drugs, and they're vacant.
There were times where I was very angry at him. There were times where, I was ashamed of him. But most of the time, I was very sad. And as hard as we tried, we couldn't help him. We struggled to try to find good, compassionate care time and time again. Even when we did, it was extremely fragmented.
We have these siloed models with mental illness and substance use. We've either picked one or the other. And as a mental health professional, I could not believe it.
When Taylor was in treatment, oftentimes, they just wanted to treat him for his addiction. If you don't treat the underlying mental health issues that typically come with addiction, you're only treating maybe not even half of it.
There's an urgency in treatment, and the gaps are big. And with things, being tainted with fentanyl these days, every relapse is potentially your child's death. And that's what happened to Taylor.
when you're the parent of someone who's suffering from addiction, you play those moments over in your mind periodically when you're going to get that phone call. But I can tell you, it doesn't prepare you for when it really happens.
I couldn't even breathe. I couldn't breathe to know that your son, doesn't get another day. I don't get to see him get married. I don't get to see him have kids.
He's just such a huge part of our family. We'll just never be able to experience that anymore.
Just having someone take on life, even in my parents' circle, Never did want to be an only child. Yeah.
Taylor had several tattoos. One of his tattoos was a quote: "If you think it's hard to watch, imagine how hard it is to live." All he wanted was for people just to love him, and at the end of the day, treat him like anybody else. So our plight, our journey from now till the time we can't, we're going to spend most of our energy trying to help those who are facing the same struggle that we faced.
I just, wanted to be treated like any other disease. They're normal people that struggle like everyone else.
They're people that people love the most in this world, and we don't treat them like that. We treat them like it's some moral failing or some lack of willpower, and it's not. It's a brain disease. Behind the use is this beautiful person who has a family and who is loved by people. I hope when you hear our story, you think about it differently.
Every day I try to honor him because he's worth honoring.
Kerri, you have so much insight to share with us tonight that you learned from Taylor's struggles and his addiction. And I really want to start with addressing stigma, which you talk about in the video. We do culturally, very much like mental health issues, we tend to blame those who are struggling, that it is a lack of willpower or it's a moral failing. And even I think that we blame parents, that it's some sort of parenting failure. But we know that addiction happens in the brain, and mental health is brain health. And yet substance use and mental health have traditionally been very siloed as completely separate issues. So what are the effects of this siloed care that you experienced?
Well, I think, so, as somebody who'd been a mental health professional for 28 years, I did mental health and trauma stuff for a living, and I treated people for substance use, but I wasn't I wasn't in inpatient treatment with them. So until it happened to Taylor, I didn't really see it as, because I was just doing outpatients, I didn't really see the gaps. But when we recognized with Taylor that he had his first inpatient hospitalization in his junior year at Freeman. And when he got there, of course, I had I was pretty involved in what was happening, and, wanted to talk to the psychiatrist and the treatment team. And, and I, when I asked questions, I said, he's got, a history of anxiety and has struggled with some ADD. And I wanted to know like what they were doing to treat that, because I felt like, that was kind of the foundation upon which this thing grabbed him, like it grabbed him. And they basically just dismissed me and blew me off. And I was asking for, like, what are we doing medically to address that? And, are we putting him on an anti-anxiety med or antidepressant? And, and would often not even get a phone call back. And I was like, this is insane. And it was, I found, and Taylor went to inpatient treatment on several occasions. And every place he went was exactly the same. And this is how it was treated. It was either, it was all about the addiction and not the things that were underneath it. And I thought, this is crazy, because they go hand in hand and they occur, I've yet to meet anyone that does, like, if you've got, you can have a mental health issue and not have a substance use disorder. But most people that I know with substance use disorders have some other underlying mental health condition that goes along with it. If they didn't have it before, they now have it. They now have it. And the truth is that people that are using and having substance use disorders or so if you have a substance use disorder, you're incredibly likely to have a mental health issue. But if you have a mental health issue, you're 50% more at risk to develop a substance use disorder. And anybody who's using substances, especially young people, we know that puts you more at risk to develop mental illness in adulthood. And so I think, it's worth understanding. And these gaps, it's not, it's important because, there, until the last year and a half, there has not even been a real standard of care when it comes to how we treat substance use disorder. So in a lot of disorders that Ashley and I treat, there's a kind of a very scripted standard of care. This is how we treat it. This is what we do. These are effective therapies. These are the effective interventions. And when it came to substance use disorder, there really wasn't anything like that. And so you had people all over the country just basically winging it. And, and we really didn't have the data. We didn't have a whole lot of research that was driving what we were doing. And it's really been in the last 2 years, and Shatterproof is a big organization that has done a lot to really drive the healthcare industry to put standards of care in place. And so, and the reason that's so important is because with these gaps, we're not treating the whole person and the whole problem. And when you don't do that, you're putting that person at risk for further struggle and mental health issues and substance use disorder. And with fentanyl out there now, guys, we are in a crisis on a scale that we have never seen. And, we're looking at overdose deaths to exceed 100,000 this year easily. And every pill that's on the street, and there, I have we have a DEA agent on our team, they've sent out recent alerts saying that any pill that is being bought on the street right now is tainted with fentanyl. And most everything that's being bought on the street, regardless of what it is tainted with fentanyl. And I think it's really important that parents know this, because I think you need to have honest conversations with your kids. And I think it's really important that kids know this.
Let's go ahead and talk about fentanyl and how strong it is and why everything is laced with it. And in the Silent No More talk, the DEA agent said everything. Like, you buy marijuana on the street, you should assume that it's laced with fentanyl.
Not fentanyl in it, right? Yeah. So I asked that question because traditionally, if you had a substance use disorder 10 or 15 years ago, the average was that you could relapse, and go to treatment at least 8 to 10 times was average before you found recovery, right? And so people with traditional drugs, they weren't overdosing at the rates that we are now. And the game changer in all this has been fentanyl. And so fentanyl is a synthetic opiate. And so we have naturally occurring opiates, which are from the poppy plant, and that's heroin, morphine. Anything that is not synthesized down into morphine is what we call a synthetic opiate. So we're looking at Percocet, oxycodone, fentanyl, carfentanil. And fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more powerful than heroin. And we also have carfentanil on the street too. And carfentanil is more powerful than fentanyl, and it's like an elephant tranquilizer, guys. So they use for massive animals, and it's just incredibly addictive. Fentanyl is used medically in our country. Burn patients, people with really severe injuries or pain, they use fentanyl. But fentanyl, two grains of fentanyl, the size of what you would see out of a salt shaker, if you ingested those 2 grains, it's enough to kill anybody on this call, and within 5 minutes. So it quickly depresses the central nervous system, and it shuts down the brain and the lungs, and people suffocate very quickly. I think, I did not realize how important it would have been for me to have Narcan in my house with Taylor struggling from, substances or even using it. But I just feel like as a parent right now, anybody can go out and buy Narcan, and Narcan is what we use to save people who've overdosed from opiates. If you never need it, great. But any CSB, the Hanover County CSB, the Henrico County CSB, they provide free Revive trainings, and they teach you, and it's all virtual. You don't have to even show your face. They show you how to use it. They show you how to recognize when somebody's in trouble. And it's free. After you do the training, you can go to any CSB and pick it up. Or they'll even, I think in some cases when people have done it from other places, they've even mailed it to them. But if you never need it, great. But if you need it and you don't have it, you don't have much time. And it's scary. I mean, I can't tell you the number of folks who, a parent that, that I know, her son was a student, at UVA, and was a great student, and he bought some Valium on the street because he was stressed out about school and grades, and the Valium was tainted with fentanyl, and he took it and went to bed and never woke up. And so I think we need to have real conversations with our kids, because I think we all need to be operating, from a place of, of reality. And the other thing, and I learned this recently from someone who reached out to me for help, and her son was addicted to fentanyl and had been using fentanyl off and on for months. And but he was coming out clean in a drug screen, and so she didn't know. And I said, well, how in the world is he coming out clean in a drug screen? But most drug screens that we are buying online for our kids, if you are drug testing your child, or you're getting it at Walgreens or CVS, like a 12 or a 5-panel screen, they're not testing for synthetic opioids. So it doesn't show up. And kids who are using, they know this. They know it doesn't show up in that drug screen. So we have to use specialized tests that actually test for that. But I was blown away. I mean, so I feel like I'm always learning new things, but I think as parents, it's important to understand that, your child could be using opiates, and if they're using synthetic opiates, it's very likely they're not going to show up on a drug screen. So it's scary.
We will circle back and talk a little more specifically about opiates further along in the conversation, but I want to talk about substance use disorder and that term, because it's actually, I have not heard it a whole lot until I started researching for this conversation. And why do we use that instead of just addiction?
Well, I mean, substance use disorder is the medical term that is used in the DSM. So it's the term that, healthcare professionals use, and it's used to describe the brain disease that is addiction and the behaviors that go along with it. And I mean, and this is not, we know that substance use disorder and addiction are brain diseases. And I think it's important to use, that terminology, because I think it helps put it in perspective, and it erases that stigma around it. I mean, we call somebody an addict or a substance abuser, I mean, it has a very negative connotation to it. And I think we're perpetuating that ignorance, that somehow these people are less than, or have something wrong with them, and they don't have the same character or morals as other people. And and I will tell you, when it happened to Taylor, and it was a shoulder surgery, and then his pain was managed with opiates, which was the biggest mistake of my life. And then he really started, his brain kept calling that, and at first it wasn't just opiates, it was anything he could get his hands on, I think, to get that dopamine high. But I mean, oh my God, I was so ashamed of him. I thought, oh my God, I'm a terrible parent. How could I even be a therapist and be helping people? And I can't even, help my own son. And, I mean, I had a lot of shame about what he was doing and his behaviors, because, anybody who is on this call who has a child who's using, and struggling, I mean, the behaviors are pretty awful. I mean, he went from being, an honor student to being a kid who, like, I had to, have a location on him to make sure he was actually even in school, and, skipping school and sneaking out of the house. And, his behavior was just all over the place and very unpredictable, and, a lot of risky behaviors, and it just wasn't the kid I knew. And I thought, Lord, what is happening? And at first I thought, well, this is just going to be one of these dark seasons in the life of a teen, and we're going to, look back on it and be like, oh. But very quickly I realized that is not at all, what was happening. And so I think the language we use around this is incredibly important, because, when they've done research studies, and this is one of the studies, they just used the term substance abuser, which I don't think is as bad as addict, but that's what they used. And what they found was that people, when they showed people, so they just used that term, and they had people rate, different different services and things that people could get. And what they found was in the study, if the participants felt like it was a substance abuser, they were less likely to get, they thought they would be less likely to get help, that they were more likely to benefit from punishment, which means they wanted them punished. They thought they were a threat to society, and that they blamed them for their substance use. And so, guys, we live in a society where, alcohol is very prevalent, and, there are legal, now we have marijuana that, we've legalized. And so we send a message to people that, use is okay if you're at a certain age, but we don't really know, who it's going to grab and who it's not going to grab. I mean, there are a lot of people, like I said, who can have a drink and have a couple drinks and you're fine, and it doesn't affect your life in the least. But we've yet to be able to kind of tell, who those people are that, it's going to grab. But we know that there are risk factors. And that's one of the things I think it's important as a parent for you all to know, like, what are these things that put your child more at risk, and so that you can be educated and your child can be educated. So these are just some facts that we'll put up. Ashley, do we have any questions that before we move on to these?
No questions at present. If anybody would like to ask a question, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, or you can enter in the chat, and I'm happy to read it out. I'm also going to be putting on, you were speaking about drug testing, and healthstreet.net is, if you go online, that's a way that parents can often provide drug tests, and it'll help you search based on your zip code of where you live, LabCorp or Quest Diagnostics, and you can get a drug test there, and you can actually specify on the HealthStreet website what types of drugs specifically you want to test for, and fentanyl can be an option that you do choose. So I often think too that it's, if you're choosing to drug test, or you feel that you're at that stage where you need to drug test your children, go ahead and do it this way. I think it's a lot less shameful to go ahead and send them to a lab like it's a doctor's office, rather than having them, have to pee in a cup in front of you. So I'm going to put the information into the chat now, so you guys have that if that's something that you're interested in.
Yeah. Thanks, Ashley. So if we look at number 1 and number 2 on this list, just so really what it's saying is the younger you start using anything, any sort of alcohol or drugs, the more likely you are to become addicted, right, into adulthood.
Right. And that's because of that undeveloped brain, right? It's not developed yet. And so the effects, it really affects how the brain develops. And so even if we can delay use by a year or two, we're dramatically dropping risk, which I think is super important.
And then number 5, so what do you guys recommend for the age that parents should start this conversation with their kids? So I will admit, so I have 11-year-olds, they'll be 12 soon, and I had not had really, other than just like don't drink and drive and just like the normal, it comes up, I had not talked to them about drugs, definitely not any sort of hard drugs. And so after attending the Silent No More webinar, I was like, I am behind the ball on this. Like, I was talking to them about fentanyl at breakfast. Because I really did. I was like, they're not too young. They do need to know, like, any drug that has come from the street, they need to assume is laced with fentanyl, and it will kill you. Especially if you have no tolerance, you haven't been using at all, and it happens. So in your professional experience as therapists, what do you recommend to parents? What age should they start talking about this?
Well, I can tell you in my school, I'm talking, kindergarten, 2nd grade, I do a lot of medication safety, because I really feel like, they're really too little cognitively and some of them have some exposure to drugs. That's the thing. They tell you about, the funny cigarette mom smoking, or, beer, or I tasted, this or that. And we're inundated in the media with it, and kids. So it's not like they're not seeing some of it. But I think, from about 3rd grade on, which for most kids is about 9 years old, like, we need to start having conversations. And I don't think we need, to be showing them pictures of people shooting up heroin, but I think we need to be having conversations about, what brain, and the science behind it, what drugs do to your brain, the things that they might commonly be introduced to first, marijuana, cigarettes, alcohol, things that they see. And I really talk to kids about what it does to your brain. and the damage it does to your brain. And there are lots of, good visuals out there to do that. But I think having those conversations, because we know by the time they're 12, I mean, the average age of use is 12 or 13 years old. So, we better be having these conversations before. And we also know that when parents are talking to their kids about these things, that they're reducing risk up to 50%. So it's not like, I think some parents are worried that maybe if we start talking about this, we're going to put these, this idea into our children's heads and maybe up the risk. And that is just not what the science or the data shows us at all. And I think kids, I know a lot of you feel that like your kids don't listen, but they do. They are.
Right. I think also too, being mindful of the messages that we're giving, even if we're not having a conversation about it directly, but as young as, 5, 6, 7, if you're coming home and you're having a glass of wine and they ask what it is and you're like, oh, mom's trying to relax. That's a message that they're filing away, that they might take into consideration at a later date. So, having those conversations of this is, beer or wine or, and you don't do that until you're 21 and that's when it's legal. But even then it can have like, negative effects and implications. I think that's something that needs to be messaged very early on. And also being mindful of how we're delivering it in a way that feels like we might think it's dismissive of what's happening, because we are, we are not addicted to substances and we are, just using it in a social manner, but they're taking that into consideration too.
Yeah, absolutely. They are. And I think recognizing too, as a parent, like, what are these things that put our kids at risk for addiction? And, so, your family genetics put your child at risk for sure. So if you have a history in your family of mental health issues or a history of substance use by other family members, it's just like if you had a risk of cancer, we wouldn't think twice to talk to our kids about, hey, we need to be careful because our family has a history of breast cancer, our family has colon cancer, or, like we need to be careful about, our health. And there's nothing different about addiction. I mean, if it runs in your family, having those conversations so that kids recognize that their brains may be primed for this more easily than maybe someone else. We know that impulsivity is a risk factor, and that was something that, Taylor, he was really, really bright, like incredibly gifted, but he was always, really impulsive. And boys tend to be more impulsive than girls, but we see it in both. But he was definitely a risk taker. He, that sensation seeking. I mean, you saw the picture maybe before where he was like, he cannot wait to ride a roller coaster. He was definitely, a risk taker. There was, I think when he was like maybe 10 or 11 years old, there was one time that I think we were in the ER, like, I don't know, in 2 months, maybe 3 or 4 times. I thought, Lord, CPS is going to come to my door and get me. But, he had a lot of injuries because he just didn't risk just wasn't something he really thought about. And then, if your child has a history of anxiety or depression, Taylor was, he had a lot of anxiety from a very young age, and we struggled with how to best manage that. And when he was in late elementary school, we looked at medication because we could see that he was so anxious, and it didn't really help in the way I'd hoped it would. But I just didn't realize how much risk that was putting him at, and then negative thinking, or kids who have these very negative inner dialogues with themselves. That is also a risk factor there, because we know that when kids are using, they're not feeling all that, right? It's an escape from a lot of these uncomfortable feelings that they have, and it really plays into the sensation seeking and the impulsivity. So, if your child has any of these risk factors, just recognizing as a parent that, that they're going to be more at risk. And when we talk about this in high schools, and I really, I keep saying to our Silent No More team, like, I think we ought to be in middle schools. I don't think we should be in high schools, but I think we should be in middle schools, because that's, I think, where we need to really make sure kids understand this. But we have high school kids come up to us all the time and say, man, I did not recognize that, I struggle with depression, and I didn't understand that whole thing about dopamine and how easily this stuff could grab me. You know, and I think, you know, it makes them think about it differently. They're like, I'm going to change what I'm doing because I don't want that. I mean, nobody that has an addiction, wants it. Nobody chooses it. You know, nobody chooses it. It is a hell on earth. It is a struggle. And Taylor's quote that you guys saw in that video, if you think it's hard to watch, and as a parent, I can tell you, if you have a kid who's struggling with a mental health issue or addiction, it is incredibly hard to watch, but it is so much harder for them to live it. You know, they don't have the life skills, they don't have the brain development, you know, to really even understand it to that degree. You know, and you know, I always think, you know, and I hear people say sometimes to me, yeah, well, that's not going to happen to my kid. And, you know, I really pray that it doesn't. But I can tell you, I did not see my life going this way. And there were many times, you know, in those dark moments when I thought, God, how has this become my life? Like, you know, how in the world is this my life? Because I just didn't see it coming. And it hit me like a train. And then we were off to the races, and we were learning in the fire. And so that's part of what, you know, makes me, you know, plug into the story and want to share it with you guys, is that, you know, I don't want you, you know, to be in my shoes, or to have a child who has these struggles. And I think, you know, prevention and getting out in front of it is, you know, really where it's at, because once they fall in that river, we're in trouble. So, you know, Taylor had anxiety and ADD. There's no doubt in my mind that he had lower dopamine levels. He had that shoulder surgery, was prescribed Percocet, and he would say, you know, about a year later, when he started to really struggle, he said, you know, my brain felt normal when he took that Percocet. He said, my brain felt normal for the first time. He's like, it was the first time that it wasn't running. And he said, I didn't realize my brain wasn't normal until that moment, you know, and then recognizing that, you know, drugs really do shoot that dopamine level up, and dopamine's responsible for pleasure, right? And teens are pretty pleasure seeking. So recognizing that whether it's nicotine, alcohol, marijuana, you know, they all raise dopamine. Now, opiates raise it the most. I mean, like 200%, but all these other drugs raise it as well. So, you know, just really being mindful of what happens. And over time, you know, what we don't want is your own brain to stop producing dopamine.
So Carrie, we have a couple questions in the chat. And I think one is they're timely given kind of what you're just talking about. One is, when your kids are younger, teens, and you know they have been drinking or using weed or vaping, how do you realistically stop it? Where there is a will, there is a way.
Well, I think you have a real conversation with them about what's going on and what they're doing. You know, first of all, you know, the function of what that is about. Is it just, you know, it's fun, it's cool, my friends are doing it. And really, you know, I think helping them realize that, you know, that they are playing Russian roulette with their own brains. And I think, like, educating kids, and, you know, I don't know about you guys, but I know for my own kids, if I said it, my kids kind of rolled their eyes and looked at me like I had three heads. But taking them to someone, you know, who works with adolescents, and, you know, and has some level of, you know, expertise in substance use disorder, you know, another adult who can, you know, really kind of help figure out and navigate what's going on there. You know, like, are there some underlying mental health conditions? And that's what this is about. And it's about, you know, like, wanting to escape, or just, you know, not feel stressed, or, you know, if it's just peer pressure or whatever. Because the bottom line is, you know, a lot of kids aren't thinking about what the consequences of their actions, but there are consequences. And the truth is, none of them know what they are. So I think, you know, one of the things that kids come back and tell me is that it's helpful for them to know. So I think, you know, just having a real conversation. If they're not listening, I would get them in to see somebody and, you know, get some help for how to navigate this. I mean, Ashley sees people and families, you know, and getting some help.
When I think too, as you're speaking, it's, you know, a lot about planting the seeds and the knowledge and the education about, you know, the impacts and negative implications. And I think that does go a long way with teens of, like, I've never thought about that before. But also too, we have to remember, like, within the family dynamic, kids look to their parents as models for structure and boundaries and consistency and consequences. So if your kids are, you know, there's a trajectory to this addictive component. And if you're catching it at a point where it's early and it's not completely off to the races, I think, you know, they're looking to you of, like, is this okay? Is this acceptable? Is it not? Are you condoning it? Or are you not condoning it? And being able to have those conversations and planting the seeds as a foundation, and then saying, you know, we don't we don't condone this and this isn't appropriate. And we'd like to have a conversation with you and nurture you through this process and like your curiosity. But also we have as your parents, set some limits and boundaries around this. I think if we handle it that way, it's not solely punishment, but also in combination with like education and support. I think that goes a long way too in planting the seeds that, you know, we're going to work on this together. We're going to figure this piece out together as you guys could develop.
Yeah, I definitely think, I mean, there definitely needs to be consequences and things like, because I think like these are things that are altering the way your kids' brains are developing. You know, and it's not for the good. So I think, you know, it is serious. And I think there are parents out there, and I hear them talk about it, and they say, well, it's just, I mean, everybody's going to drink at some point or smoke a little pot. You know, and the thing is, you know, having that, we don't have the luxury of having that attitude anymore. Because the truth is, the science shows us that the younger kids are using, the more at risk they are for this, and the more serious it is. And the drugs that are out there are a lot stronger than, you know, 5-10 years ago. They're a lot stronger. And with things, you know, laced with fentanyl, we do not have, you know, I mean, you know, kids, I mean, you know, buying things on the street. I mean, I mean, everything they do could be their last thing that they do. You know, and I think that is really scary as a parent. I mean, you know, I know when I was growing up, I mean, the worst thing anybody was really doing was marijuana, you know, and drinking. And now, you know, there's this drug that could be in anything and that can kill you within 5 minutes. And that's just, I mean, that is incredibly scary. And I think we need kids to recognize, you know, just how dangerous all this stuff is.
Mm-hmm. There's another couple questions, but this one is really interesting. If Taylor hadn't used an opioid after shoulder surgery, then what else would have had it moved up on me. And what else would have made his brain to feel normal? Like if he's saying this is the first time, like what are those natural things that we can maybe do to kind of help kids' brains slow down and feel normal?
Yeah. So, you know, so there definitely are things. So we like to talk about exercise. You know, there are a lot of natural dopamine boosters, exercise, mindfulness. And I know people have, you know, heard about this, but meditation gives you an incredible boost in your dopamine level. I think it boosts your dopamine level 64%, and it stays like that for about 72 hours. So, you know, I know in my school with my kids, I've been teaching mindfulness, and my little ones meditate, you know, every single day, 3-4 times a day. And one of the things when we started it, I knew how good it was for kids' brains to learn that path to calm. Because it's just like anything else, right? You mean, when you first start to do it, they go, I don't like this, because they're not used to their brains being still. But then over time, the brain learns the path to get there really quickly, and it learns to regulate itself. And we know that kids that meditate have bigger hippocampuses, and that's the part of your brain that stores memory and helps you learn. And, you know, and it really lights up that prefrontal cortex, and it really calms down the amygdala, and the amygdala is responsible for that stress response in our brains. And so it helps that part of the brain stay calm. And so, you know, like my little kids meditate every single day. For teenagers, the Calm app is great. Headspace is great. Any of you in education, there's a free, Headspace is doing a free thing for educators. You can use it in your classroom. You don't have to make up anything, right? You can just Headspace for educators, and it's free for a year. So it's just out there for everybody. But it is, you know, that's a great thing for, you know, kids to be able, you know, to do. But finding things they love, music. I mean, listening to your favorite song shoots your dopamine level up. I mean, there are a lot of things that help kids, you know, get those natural highs. But I think for Taylor, you know, I can't, you know, I don't have a crystal ball, but, you know, we gave him the most addictive drug on the planet, which is an opioid. And so, you know, I think that was, and, you know, and I don't know, I mean, you know, as he got older, if he experimented with alcohol and marijuana, and which my instinct is he would have, you know, would we have ended up in the same boat? Probably, maybe, I don't know. But I sure wish, you know, I sure wish it hadn't been something that, you know, was given him to manage pain. I just wish, you know, I wish it wasn't that. Because, you know, they always say, you know, nobody starts with heroin, but when you're giving your kids, you know, an opioid to manage wisdom teeth or whatever, I mean, that's basically what we're giving kids to manage pain. And, you know, I know if, you know, if the surgeon had said to me, hey, we're going to give him some heroin, because it all synthesizes in the same thing, right? I'd be like, no, you're not. We're not. And my daughter, she ends up having the same surgery 5 years later, and we don't touch an opiate, and it was just fine. So I think, as parents, really recognizing and having hard conversations, with healthcare professionals. I would love to sit here and tell you that healthcare has come a long way, and they have not. They have not. And a lot of my, I'm not throwing anybody under a bus, but a lot of my advocacy is trying to partner with healthcare to say we've got to do better, and especially with young people, because we're putting them at tremendous risk. We're putting them at tremendous risk, because I have a hard time, that's how we got there.
Right. And that's, if you are, your kids are being prescribed an opiate and they've had a really tough surgery and experience, I think you have to ask yourself, would you rather, them endure 5 days of pain that's maybe a little bit worse, but manageable with like Tylenol, or potentially end up with an addiction that could frankly could kill them. So, I think at the end of the day, like we would say, hey, let's let them endure 5 days of a little bit more pain with Tylenol versus putting something in that could really harm them.
Right. And I think with sports injuries in our country, we're really quick to try to get kids back out on the field. And even in our country, we have this kind of mentality, like we don't want anybody to be in pain. And, like you said, like just if you need to take it easy for 5 days and your child is not put in any risk. But the truth is there are non-opioid ways to manage pain. And, Blair was given something, and I think we can move the slide probably, was given something. Let's go back. Let's talk about dopamine a little bit. Go back to where you were. We'll talk about that.
Mhm.
So that the dopamine piece, or I think we've covered that. Let's go to the next slide. So this is when Taylor was actually getting ready to go into recovery for the last time, and he'd gone to college and was off the rails really quickly. And he, had become opioids were now the primary issue. And he right here is detoxing from opioids that he got at college, and he was so sick. I've never seen anybody so sick in my life. And I would go see him each day while he was there, and I said to him, "Why don't you take something to help, take this, not be in so much pain?" And he said, "Because I want to remember every second of it, because I don't ever want to do this again in my life." But what I want you guys to realize is that it can take the brain up to 2 years to start producing dopamine again. And Taylor was at tremendous risk, and it didn't matter how he came off of it. And I had no idea. So I think it's really important to realize, how much risk, I did not realize how much risk he was at. He had a 96% chance of relapsing without some kind of help for the opioids. Because once that is the problem, you're in big trouble. So, when they brain scan people, they can see that, it takes up to 2 years for that brain to start really doing its thing again. But I'm working with a couple of young people with opioid addictions right now, and, they know that it could take that long. And I think it really helps that they understand what's happening to them. Taylor did not understand. He was like, "This is ridiculous. I feel terrible." But they understand, and they're trying to do things like meditate and things to kind of jumpstart their own brains.
Ashley, do we have any other questions? We are getting really tight on time.
Yes, yep. The last one, I think this is probably a big one for many, is how would you recommend handling a teen who is using but won't admit they have a problem and won't agree to treatment?
Yeah. So, I think it's a big problem with addiction. I think it takes a lot for people to recognize that they have a problem with it. I think there's so much stigma around it. And, Taylor really struggled with, admitting that he was struggling with addiction. And, because he would say, I don't want to be an addict, and I don't want this struggle. And, and then there would be times when he recognized that, he really did have a substance use disorder. And then there would be times when he was like, "I'm fine. I'm just like everybody else." And I think that's the hard thing with a young person, is not recognizing it. But the thing is as a parent, while they're under 18, you have all the power, right? And so you have the ability to put them into treatment, whether they want to be there or not. And I would, say to you, the best is if you can get buy-in. If the courts are involved, courts can help kind of hang some things over their heads. But in truth, until they really want to get better, But, you know, a lot of times I see people open their eyes in treatment when they're surrounded by other people with their same struggles, and they start to recognize like, hey, this, you know, this is something that, you know, this, I do have a problem. We're on the outside, but I think most teens are not, you know, they don't want to admit they have a problem. But the line for problem is use despite consequence. And I don't know if Ashley, that's your line too, because I often get asked like, you know, how do I know, you know, when does it reach the point where it's a substance use disorder, or like where, you know, we need help? And you know, and I think, you know, when your child, you know, when their lives are being affected in negative ways, so school, you know, sports, your family life is being affected in a negative way, and they continue use despite all these negative consequences that are kind of occurring in their lives. And I think that's, you know, kind of how you know, like, okay, we're in trouble. The earlier we intervene, the better. And you know, I would always say to myself, because Taylor spent a lot of time mad at me because I did everything I could to make it difficult for him to use, and to try to get him the best help possible, and, you know, not enable him in any way. But, you know, he spent a lot of time mad at me, and I would say to myself, like, I can live with him being mad at me. I would rather him be mad at me and alive than happy with me and dead.
Mhm.
So, you know, I mean, I think that's our job as parents, right? We're the bumpers. We're, you know, we're the guardrails, and it's not an easy job to be a guardrail. I have a mentor who said to me, you know, have you ever driven over the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel? I'm like, oh yeah. And he said, well, how fast would you go? How fast would you go if there were no guardrails? And I was like, I don't even think I'd get on it. Like, you know, and he said, well, parenting's just like that, right? You're the guardrail. And we get dinged up pretty bad, right? But that's our job, is to keep them on the rails. And so it's not an easy job. And so I think as parents, if you are struggling, you don't know what to do, there are professionals who can help you know what to do. Go see somebody like Ashley. We have a lot of great clinicians in our community. And, you know, like, talk to them about the situation you're in, and they can give you some good, you know, some good guidance and some good advice about, you know, here are next steps. Because this isn't the kind, this disease looks different on everybody. So there's not like this prescription that we can say, well, hey, if you do this, this, and this, you're going to be good. You know, it's really a case by case kind of thing. And we don't have all the answers. I mean, if I had the answers, you know, this would not be my platform. My son would still be here, and, you know, this is not what I would be doing. We don't. And it's a beast of a disease. And I don't, you know, and there are ways that we can prevent it. And that's really why we're on here tonight talking about, you know, how to do just that.
Thank you so much. We are out of time, and I hate to cut this conversation short, which is what it feels like, because it is such an important conversation. And I think that we have to talk more about substance use and the connection with mental health. And I will do a plug real quick before we wrap up for the Cameron K. Gallagher Mental Health Resource Center, which is part of Virginia Treatment Center for Children, which is the Richmond's Pediatric Psychiatric Hospital. It is part of Children's Hospital of Richmond at VCU. That is all a mouthful, but it is, the resource center is a wonderful resource, and it is for the community. So as a parent, you can call in if you are looking for a therapist, or particularly substance use help. And, you know, I contacted them actually and asked, like, hey, can you give me like just your top resources that you give in Central Virginia? And that will go out in the follow-up email. But interestingly, they said, you know, we really don't get this question much, which surprises them considering what a huge problem substance use is among teens. So again, we just have that siloed approach, and we all need to start bridging it more.
Yeah. And no, if your kid's struggling and you're a parent, this is not a parenting fail, guys. It's not. I mean, you could be the best parent in the world. And I mean, this is one of those diseases that it doesn't discriminate any more than cancer does. So, you know, none of us would be embarrassed if our child had cancer to go out and ask for help. And so ask for help. It matters. And there are people that are, you know, willing to help you. And, you know, and if you know, the sooner you intervene, the better chance you have. And the sooner we, you know, delay use, the better we all are. So no, this is not a parenting fail. There's no shame in it.
Absolutely. So we hope you leave this evening with a few more tools in your toolbox for supporting the teens in your life. Look for an email in the coming days with a link to the recording of the event, as well as a list of additional resources. Thank you so very much to Kerri Rhodes and Ashley Morgan Soukup for sharing your expertise and insight with us this evening. Our next conversation with CKG is self-harm and suicide with Ashley on November 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll talk about the relationship between self-harm behavior, suicide ideation, and suicide attempts. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, suicide is the second leading cause of death for ages 10 to 24 in the United States. Learn common risk factors, signs to watch for, and how to seek help. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great evening.